Good afternoon to you. 3:06 now. News Talk 105.9 WMAL, where we are making sense of the news. Coming up, the Attorney General of the state of West Virginia, Patrick Morrisey, joins us this hour to react to the Supreme Court's 9-0 dunking on a ballot rigging scheme the left has been trying to conduct nationwide. The Supreme Court stopping it today. We'll get into the details with the Attorney General. At 3:30, 4 o'clock, Mark Krikorian is here from the Center for Immigration Studies. We'll get the latest, yet another record month at our border. The invasion continues. And at 5 o'clock, my exclusive interview with the former and perhaps future president of the United States, Donald Trump, is with us. We had a great conversation with him last night. I will be airing two parts of the interview today. Well, all in the 5 o'clock hour. You'll be able to hear the whole thing. Don't miss that. He's got a lot to say on a whole bunch of issues. More on that in a moment. 888-630-9625. 888-630-WMAL. Yeah, Donald Trump was in Richmond on Saturday ahead of Super Tuesday, of course, which includes the Commonwealth of Virginia, trying to whip up some support in that state. And he had a lot of energy, didn't he? Corey and Ganamore, my producer, he was out there on Saturday. Got to see him up close and personal in Richmond. He had a lot of energy, and it's not surprising to see why. I mean, he's clearly got the wind in his sails right now. Despite all of the efforts to cannonball his ship, it's still floating, and it's still moving ahead, full steam ahead, because you've got, one, the polls are just looking fantastic for him right now. You see the New York Times and CBS polls this weekend, just polling catastrophes for who I call New Low Joe. New York Times headline, Voters Doubt Biden's Leadership and Favor Trump, says Times and Siena poll. Mr. Biden has 43% support. That lags behind Mr. Trump's 48% support in the national survey of registered voters. Now, this is not a swing state poll. This is national registered voters. It is a very bad sign for Joe Biden and a very good sign for Donald Trump right now. That's what the numbers look like. Meanwhile, CBS assesses that likely voters prefer Trump over Biden by 4 points, 52 to 48. And that is an utter catastrophe for the left, which, by the way, is all the more reason why they're going to get even more crazy heading up to Election Day and beyond. Watching as their chance at retaining power is slipping away, they get dangerous, don't they? And they get meddlesome. In fact, in my conversation with Donald Trump coming up at 5 o'clock, he does talk about how he doesn't think Joe Biden makes it to Election Day this year. Now, he didn't get into immense clarity on that. I did ask him, you'll hear it coming up in the interview, what will in the end take him out. But he just thinks it's very unlikely that Joe Biden sticks around all the way through Election Day. And when I see news stories like this, the polling, certainly, the big decision out of the Supreme Court case today that stops the left from rigging ballots state by state, all of that adds up to, well, the left is going to have to do something. If they want to retain power, their by any means necessary attitude is going to require either they give Biden the hook or they launch even more attacks on the voters. Or both. One more thing on polling right now. Nate Silver, the lefty political analyst, the data guy, was expressing today on Twitter, now X. He says that 10% of Biden's 2020 voters are now saying that they're going to vote for Trump in 2024. 10%. He compared that to less than 1% of Trump 2020 voters who now say they're going to vote for Biden. The vote switching, to the extent that happens at all today in America, is happening in Trump's direction. 10% of former Biden voters are going to vote for Trump. And by the way, that wouldn't be the first time that phenomenon has happened. Remember, Trump picked up a tremendous number of old Obama-Biden voters the first time when he ran in 2016. Could he pull it off again, this time with Biden in 2024? We'll see. Nate Silver's warning the left right now that it looks like voters aren't just sitting out the election who voted for Biden. Many of them will actually vote for Trump. More on that coming up. First, the Supreme Court today. We have an immense decision that just came out of the Supreme Court this morning, kind of expected coming through the weekend, ahead of Super Tuesday, where Colorado does have its vote tomorrow, its primary vote. The justices, all 9 of them, have said that you cannot bar Donald Trump from the ballot in Colorado or any other state. These states can't rig their ballots to exclude Trump as an option from their voters. Voters are entitled to make that decision for themselves in those states. The Supreme Court ruling 9-0 today that former President Donald Trump cannot be removed from Colorado's 2024 ballot. The Daily Caller reporting here. The Colorado Supreme Court found Trump ineligible for the state's ballot in December, ruling he was disqualified under Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. The Civil War-era provision bars individuals who took an oath to the Constitution and then engaged in insurrection from holding office. Quote, because the Constitution makes Congress, rather than the states, responsible for enforcing Section 3 against federal office holders and candidates, we reverse, the court's ruling stated today. The justices expressed concerns about the patchwork of outcomes that would result from states reaching various decisions, noting, quote, an evolving electoral map could dramatically change the behavior of voters, parties, and states across the country in different ways and at different times. Nothing in the Constitution requires that we endure such chaos, arriving at any time or different times, up to and perhaps beyond the inauguration, they wrote. Now, not all 9 justices were on the same page today as to whose job it was to disqualify Donald Trump or any other candidate and what the format would take. They just agreed that the states couldn't do it. Newsweek today, headlines, Supreme Court's quiet division on Trump ballot case. They point out that all 9 justices did agree to reverse the Colorado Supreme Court's decision, removing Trump from the state's primary ballot in Monday's ruling. But just 5 of the justices determined that only Congress can enforce the insurrection clause in the Constitution. Quote, while the outcome was unanimous, supported by all 9 justices, several justices, Jackson, Kagan, Sotomayor, and to a lesser extent, Amy Coney Barrett, all the women of the court, objected to the court going beyond what was necessary to decide the case. Former federal prosecutor and elected state attorney Michael McAuliffe told Newsweek. The 3 liberal justices on the bench, Sotomayor, Kagan, and Brown Jackson, agreed that no individual state should decide the eligibility of a national candidate, but they rejected the idea that the clause should only apply if Congress were to enact a particular legislation pursuant to another section of the 14th Amendment. Justice Amy Coney Barrett, a Trump appointee, stayed out of the dispute, writing that, in my judgment, this is not the time to amplify disagreement with stridency. So Amy Coney Barrett kind of wanted to sit it out and say, hey, let's not talk about who has this power. Let's just say Colorado can't do it. That's what Amy Coney Barrett wanted to say. Meanwhile, the 5 conservative justices on the court say, well, this is for Congress to decide. And meanwhile, you had the lefty justices saying, well, not necessarily with legislation. Let me first get some of the media reaction here today, just so you can hear how crazy the left is about all of this. Here's how NBC News reacted just as the news was breaking.
And a good Monday morning to you. We're coming on the air with some breaking news from the Supreme Court about former President Donald Trump. The High Court just said moments ago that Mr. Trump can stay on this year's presidential ballot in Colorado after that state barred him from its Republican primary.
Put differently, Colorado can't rig the ballot.
The Colorado Supreme Court had disqualified Mr. Trump under a constitutional provision that bars people who engage in insurrection from holding office.
Technically, it barred Democrats from rebelling against the United States during the Civil War.
Decision today, of course, coming ahead of tomorrow's Super Tuesday contest when 15 states, including Colorado, will hold primary elections.
ABC News acknowledged today this is a rare moment where you get a 9-0 decision.
A rare moment of unanimity on a usually divided court. All 9 justices of the Supreme Court agree that states cannot kick candidates off the ballot under the 14th Amendment.
Yeah, Colorado's Secretary of State who pushed for all of this, Jena Griswold, she's an insane person, and she expressed that today on MSNBC.
My larger reaction is disappointment. I do believe that states should be able, under our Constitution, to bar oath-breaking insurrectionists. And ultimately,
Donald Trump was never convicted by any court of such a thing. He hasn't even been charged by any of these Biden administration officials who are going after him.
This decision leaves open the door for Congress to act to pass authorizing legislation. But we know that Congress is a nearly non-functioning body. So ultimately, it will be up to the American voters to save our democracy in November.
Oh, the horror. We'd have to leave it to the voters. This is what Colorado wanted to avoid in the first place. And when she says to save our democracy, what she's really trying to say is to vote for Biden. A vote for Donald Trump, in her view, would be the end of democracy. If the voters prefer the candidate she doesn't, that is the conclusion of democracy. Does that add up for you? Of course not. It's nonsense. It's total nonsense. And she should have been laughed out of the room. Should have been laughed out of the room, but she wasn't. Everyone's nodding along as she's explaining all of this on MSNBC. Yeah, I'm a crazy person. Oh, that makes sense. Katie Tur today on NBC.
Do you think this court is partisan?
I think this court has had obviously some pretty big issues. Whether it has been, Clarence Thomas's wife's role, gifts that have gone unreported. And there are some pretty big decisions that have come out of the court that
They demonize Clarence Thomas. They hate that a black man has any sort of, constitutional adherence whatsoever. They hate that about him. They've hated it about him as long as he's been on the court. And they throw the most disgraceful attacks at him, and even to this very day. It was a 9-0 decision. They're attacking Clarence Thomas. What does that tell you?
Agree with, and I think strip Americans of our basic human rights and fundamental freedoms.
Yeah, that's right. Preventing you from voting is the fulfillment of your rights. Are you listening to this idiocy? Jamie Raskin went on CNN, Democrat, and he says he's got a plan here, and Swalwell's a part of it.
I am working with a number of my colleagues, including Debbie Wasserman Schultz and Eric Swalwell, to revive legislation that we had to set up a process by which we could determine that someone who committed insurrection is disqualified by Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. And the House of Representatives already impeached Donald Trump for participating in insurrection.
He was acquitted by the Senate.
By inciting it. So the House has already pronounced upon that.
It isn't pronounced. Does this guy not understand anything? Of course he probably does. He's just being evil. But Jamie Raskin, you just heard him, he's promising to use legislation to stop voters from having the choice to choose Donald Trump. That's what he wants to do. He wants to use legislation to prevent voters from having options. That would be voter suppression at the hands of the federal government. And then he confused a mere impeachment with an actual conviction. Again, on purpose, designed to mislead MSNBC's gullible audience. Excuse me, CNN's gullible audience in this case. So that's the plan. Now, there are a lot of plans developing at this hour that are not good. Now, as good as the decision was today, it's the common sense decision. But the left is already on the move here. And what that means for us is that they are seriously contemplating staging a genuine insurrection on January 6th of 2025. Here's how the game plan's going right now. The left is observing today's decision by the court to say that it is the obligation of Congress to decide whether or not someone is qualified or not to be president. They view that as an invitation to go forward and say Donald Trump is ineligible to be president of the United States, and therefore we will reject his electors on January 6th of 2025. In fact, the left has already been broadcasting its intention here in its magazines and in its legal arguments. Remember the oral argument from just a couple weeks ago on this very subject in Colorado on the ballot rigging scheme. Ketanji Brown Jackson asked the Colorado lawyer, Jason Murray, what happens here if Colorado loses this case and Trump's allowed to still be on the ballot? What happens? Jason Murray warned of what he said would be consequences that, quote, came back with a vengeance.
If we think that the states can't enforce this provision for whatever reason in this context, in the presidential context, what happens next in this case? I mean, is it done?
If this court concludes that Colorado did not have the authority to exclude President Trump from the presidential ballot,
as it did today,
on procedural grounds, I think this case would be done, but I think it could come back with a vengeance because ultimately members of Congress may have to make the determination after a presidential election if President Trump wins about whether or not he's disqualified from office and whether to count votes cast for him under the Electoral Count Reform Act. So President Trump himself urges this court in the first few pages of his brief to resolve the issues on the merits, and we think that the court should do so as well.
So here you have Jason Murray representing Colorado saying yank Trump from the ballot. Don't give them the option in Colorado to vote for the guy, saying that if the court strikes down what Colorado is doing, which they just did today, well, guess what happens next? Then the left will attempt to reject Donald Trump on January 6th. And I'm telling you, I'm reading through some of the lefty magazines today. These are just in the last few weeks, and they're all beginning to make this argument, and they say things could get very dangerous and perhaps, in their words, even violent beginning next year. More on that in just a moment. So in the Associated Press's coverage of the Supreme Court case today, they're already floating using January 6th of this coming year to reject Donald Trump's electors. They name that among the possible outcomes here, and they say it could be a potential nightmare, is that if Congress is the only entity that can determine whether a presidential hopeful is indeed disqualified for engaging in insurrection, that it makes that determination on January 6th of 2025 when required to certify a possible Trump victory in the presidential election. And they say here that this could get really dicey going into the next year. Also, The Atlantic a week ago just wrote a piece how Democrats could disqualify Trump if the Supreme Court doesn't. They say a Trump win could lead to a constitutional crisis in Congress. Democrats would have to choose between confirming a winner many of them believe is ineligible and defying the will of the voters who elected him. Their choice could be decisive, as their victory in a House special election in New York last week demonstrated Democrats have a serious chance of winning a majority in Congress in November, even if Trump recaptures the presidency on the same day. If that happens, they could have the votes to prevent him from taking office, The Atlantic writes. In interviews, senior House Democrats wouldn't commit to certifying a Trump win, saying they would do so only if the Supreme Court affirms his eligibility. But during oral arguments, liberal and conservative justices alike seemed inclined to dodge the question of his eligibility altogether and throw the decision to Congress. Quote, that would be a colossal disaster, said Representative Adam Schiff of California to The Atlantic. Quote, we already had one horrendous January 6th. We don't need another. Adam Schiff, of all people, warning us that the left could lead to a, quote, horrendous January 6th here by trying to stop the electors that the voters send for Donald Trump coming up in 2025. The New Yorker also, with a piece earlier this year, said this in a piece entitled The Supreme Court and the Risks of January 6, 2025. Quote, it all but guarantees that if Trump wins, members of Congress, a sizable portion of the public, and a number of states will contest his ability to hold office. There's little chance of his getting a 2/3 vote of each House of Congress saying that he can hold office, or of his and his supporters coming close to conceding that he even needs Congress's approval to hold the presidency. Some states may attempt to refuse to certify electoral votes for Trump on the grounds that he is disqualified under Section 3. They're referring to the 14th Amendment. Some members of Congress may refuse to count electoral votes for him on the same grounds on January 6th of 2025. They say we might see something even closer to how the framers conceived of the term insurrection come 2025 than anything that happened on 2021. They worry that this could soon become a violent nightmare. Those are the words of the New Yorker. The left is on the move here. They always are. The Attorney General of the state of West Virginia, Patrick Morrisey, will join us just moments away. We'll get his reaction to all of the news today and what comes next. Hey, good afternoon to you. 3:35 here, News Talk 105.9 WMAL, where we're making sense of the news. Coming up on the program, we'll be joined by Mark Krikorian from the Center for Immigration Studies. Record numbers of border crossers yet again for the month of February. It's a leap over the border year here in America. And then we've got Donald Trump, the former president, future president of the United States, it seems. He'll be joining us in the whole next hour, 5 o'clock. Excuse me, about an hour and a half from now, 5 o'clock. We're going to start airing our interview with Donald Trump. I spoke with him last night for some time. We'll play the whole thing coming up in the 5 o'clock hour. You can join us at 888-630-9625, 888-630-WMAL. Okay, so big Supreme Court decision today, 9-0, that the left in each of the individual states is not allowed to rig the ballots to prevent voters from selecting Donald Trump. One of the people who helped make that happen is the Attorney General of the state of West Virginia. He filed an amicus brief in this case to the United States Supreme Court. He is Patrick Morrisey, and he joins us now. Mr. Attorney General, good to have you on the phone. Thank you very much, sir.
Hey, it's good to be with you today, and it is a really important day for our constitutional republic and a situation where we can say the Supreme Court really got it right. So I'm very appreciative in their unanimous decision today. I think that sets a very important tone going forward in this election.
What is the message of all 9 justices backing this idea that no, Colorado can't do this? What are the liberal justices expressing by signing on there?
Well, I think it's really clear this was a really big stretch on the other side, and it showed that the other side is willing to go to the greatest lengths possible in order to keep President Trump off the ballot, which to me is the ultimate in election interference. And so you heard the court loud and clear say that this is a federal matter and that you can't have an unelected person in Maine do this. You can't have a state Supreme Court in Colorado rule this without any affirmation by Congress on the federal side. And that makes a lot of sense when you think about it, because this is the presidency. It's a unique national office. And so you look to whether someone has been guilty of insurrection as per a federal finding. And I think the fact that President Trump hasn't even been charged with the crime of insurrection, let alone any finding that there's insurrection, had to have motivated the court significantly.
I know. It's like it's so preposterous, yet here we are. The Secretary of State in Colorado today, Jena Griswold, expressed that she's upset about this. And she said it's going to, unfortunately, in her view, it'll be up to the American voters now to save our democracy. What does that mean? What could she possibly even mean by this?
Well, think about that sentence. Of course, it should be up to the American voters to always save our democracy and to preserve our Constitution. You need that. And so you don't want to take the power of the decision-making away from the people. But that's exactly what the Colorado Supreme Court tried to do. Yeah. That's what Maine and Illinois are trying to do. It doesn't make any sense. So I think this is very reassuring.
Yes.
The fact that it's unanimous sends a message. And what I would argue is that this starts to separate the really far out wackadoodle crowd from kind of the, more moderate, or I don't know if I'd say moderate, but the people that understand that you just can't make this stuff up as you go along. So that you shouldn't let the courts just go in and knock someone off the ballot this way.
But this is a far-reaching decision insofar as it's not just Colorado, correct? It's every other state that was attempting to remove Donald Trump from the ballot and prevent the voters from having that option.
That's correct. They were very clear that you would need to have a federal finding before you could take him off.
Okay, so now that brings me to the next step. The left, as you and I both know, it has an appetite for going as far as it possibly can for power. So if now they're hearing, okay, this only can be done by Congress, what implications does that have going forward? I saw Jamie Raskin today suggesting that he's trying to cobble together some legislation with his colleagues to banish Trump from the ballot nationwide. And also now the Associated Press is floating this idea that on January 6th of 2025, should Trump win, that Democrats may engage in rejecting his electors on the idea that he's an insurrectionist. What do you expect here?
Look, I think the American public just learned great insight into the radical ways of the left and just how far they're willing to go to prevent President Trump from being the nominee or ultimately taking office. And I think it should be very clear that President Trump is going to continue to grow in strength and that all these efforts had a political motive in place, and it shouldn't be that way, whether you're talking about to get someone off the ballot or to try to prosecute them, for heaven's sake. I think that this is not going to go well for the far left because they overplayed their hand, and I think that most reasonable people will agree with the Supreme Court and think, okay, this issue should be put to bed. Now let the voters decide. And the more you keep hearing from the Jamie Raskins of the world or these other people that there's somehow more that needs to be done, I think that they're going to really make themselves in such a small minority of the American public that their odds of electoral success will go down.
Mr. Attorney General, we're talking to Patrick Morrisey from West Virginia. Do you agree that these efforts are election rigging, what they're doing? They're trying to rig the ballots?
Yeah, look, they're interfering at a minimum. So, of course, they're trying to set up the rules to their own advantage before any vote is cast.
Yeah.
And you see it in the context of this effort to block him from going on the ballot.
Sure.
You see it in the context of going after President Trump with all of these allegations in court. I think virtually all of them, people could look at them even on a bipartisan basis. You probably get most Americans to agree that these allegations should be thrown into the trash heap. And so when you have that kind of dynamic and these guys stopping at any length, they're willing to go to the cows come home in order to obtain their way.
Right.
Then when people start to see that, they go, wow, this is really corrupt. And their eyes are opened in a way that perhaps they weren't open in 2020. I think that's good for President Trump, and that's good for the Republican Party.
But they wouldn't be doing this were they not scared that voters would choose Trump, correct? I mean, this is meant to foreclose on voters having the option.
Well, correct. I mean, the fact is they're watching the polls. They're seeing that President Trump has been growing in strength, and they want to do anything they can to prevent it from happening. I don't think that's going to happen, and there are going to be a lot of people that stand up and say, no, we're up to your tricks. We're aware of what's going on, and this is going to be a fair process, and it's not going to be with all the unusual circumstances that you saw in 2020. I think that's important, and most Americans want that kind of fair process.
Yes. And so how dangerous is all of this? I mean, obviously, today we had an institution that withstood these attacks. But it strikes me that the very party that talks about threats to democracy is absolutely the party that's leading them. Because, you know, in fact, I've got President Trump coming up on the show. I interviewed him last night. We'll play that later in our program. And he said that very thing. He said, you know, it's Joe Biden who's the true threat to democracy here, and voters should know that.
Look, I think it was a dark cloud that hung over all of our heads while it was being decided. But fortunately, the clouds have broken up, and the sun is peering through today because of the Supreme Court's decision. And it's because they did the right thing. And you like to see that your institutions can stand up to the political pressure. And once again, it was encouraging to see Jackson and Sotomayor step up and do this, and Elena Kagan. And they may not have agreed fully with the rest of the justices, but I think that it was so clear to them that they weren't going to let these egregious theories win the day. So I am actually encouraged. I think it's very positive that black cloud has lifted just a little bit.
And could you give me just a legal assessment here? Those justices that concurred, but both the liberal justices as well as Amy Coney Barrett, they offered concurring opinions. Their differences were about what? How to actually disqualify a candidate from the ballot?
Yeah, I think that they wouldn't have gone as far as the majority did in articulating some of the rules for removal, but they all did agree with the basic fact that Trump should not be removed from the ballot because there's been no federal action. So there may be some different opinions in terms of what that federal action would look like and how to interpret the various provisions of the 14th Amendment, but they were unified on the broad theme that President Trump should not be tossed off, and at a minimum, there's been no federal activity that would justify any decision like Colorado is pushing.
And the majority held that this needs to be an official piece of legislation to bar someone from the ballot?
Yeah, I mean, I think they said that the federal government would have to act. There's probably some flexibility about what that would mean.
Right.
But I think that when you're talking about the federal government, you're talking about an act of Congress that would be signed into law, and that it's clear that the federal government would have the authority to weigh in on this. But I can't see anything other than some other clarification on Section 3 that would come from Congress, which would put another type of candidate in at risk.
What if Democrats use January 6th of next year and they say he's not eligible, he's an insurrectionist, therefore we can reject his electors?
Look, I don't think that's going to happen because the reality is that you're looking at a situation where they may try to pass something. I think it's going to be easily stopped, at least while we don't have the filibuster rules changed, right? This is one of the arguments, of course, for keeping the filibuster, because if you could have something in place that you could get in with a simple majority. And heaven forbid if we were to lose the majority, but and they're to take office prior, you would be concerned about it. I don't think this is going to be a very real concern because they're just going to lack the numbers to do the things they want to do. But we're going to cross that bridge when we come to it.
All right. In the meantime, thank you very much for your time today. The Attorney General of West Virginia, Patrick Morrisey. Good to talk to you, sir.
Hey, thanks so much. Appreciate it.
Always nice to have your thoughts. All right, so, a big decision today, a lot of concern about what comes next. Let's take a phone call here. We've got Victoria calling in from Greenbelt, line 3. Victoria, good afternoon. You're on the Vince Coglianese Show. Hello.
Good afternoon. I've so waited to speak to you. I've been listening since 2015.
Oh, thank you.
Since the first Hillary and Clinton debate. And I just want to say how important this is today. This is a major win for us. And if anybody is half as excited as I am, they're giving thanks to God for this. But the reason I wanted to call is because we really need you and the WMAL to stop telling us how powerful the woke is. I mean, inform us of their strategies, because we can't count on the Republican Congress that greatly. There are a few,
right,
but we really need you to tell us about strategies that we can use and encourage us on how to take advantage of opportunities and empower us with knowledge and strategies. I'm a Black woman, and I'm telling you, the change is happening, but we've got to know what to do. We've got to mobilize, and we need you. You're the best, Vince, and then Dan. But I'm telling you, sometimes it's really hard to listen to you guys because all we hear is how great they – well, I'm just telling the truth. But it's really hard to listen to how great the woke is, and they're really not that.
You mean
great.
When you say the woke, you mean the left broadly and their strategies?
The Democratic Party.
Now I should point out that I don't contend that they're great, but I do contend that they're on the move, and I think it'd be foolish to not look ahead and say, what are they going to do next? And they're writing it. They're writing it, Victoria, in all of their magazines. They're talking about it openly in the court. You had that lawyer arguing before the Supreme Court recently.
Tell us how.
What's that, Victoria? Let me just make this point real quick.
How great we are.
Well, first of all, you are great. Obviously, I could tell that immediately as soon as you picked up the phone. But on this point, I just want to be a realist about what comes next, because they're already promising chaos. Remember in the last election, they were already banking on chaos. They had plans to have states secede from the Union if Donald Trump won by the Electoral College count in 2020. So they're always kind of gaming this out. And so my obligation is, okay, what are they up to? And I'm going to pass the word along, Victoria, because we've got to be ready for it, don't we?
Amen. And you should. That's what we need you for. But we also need to be empowered with how can we mobilize? Yep. What can we do at the local level? What can we do? I come from a government relations background, but I'm just saying we have to mobilize, and we need you to tell us those opportunities.
Well, here's one for you, Victoria. Remember, one of the pieces I just cited was talking about, look, if the Democrats do control the majority in the House come January, that's where they can cause the most damage if they control the majority, especially going into January 6th of 2025. This is why it is so important to do the very thing you're talking about, to mobilize, get active, and make sure the Democrats don't have the majority in the House come next year.
Amen. Even if we have to switch parties for a minute to get the job done.
Whatever it takes.
I'm just saying, we've got to garner our power, and we need that message. It's very hard some days. I actually have to turn you guys off.
Oh, come on now. I'm there with you, Victoria. All right. Hey, Victoria, thank you. I appreciate the call. I really do. And keep on that ranking system. Let me know who else is on the list and what order at some point, would you? It's 3:51 now. Yeah, the left very angry about today's Supreme Court decision. Very, very angry. Jamie Raskin says he's working on legislation to stop voters from selecting Trump. Lawrence Tribe, good old Larry Tribe on MSNBC. He was upset about all this today, too. Here's his analysis.
That's what the court did in this case. And it left basically unenforced and, for all practical purposes, unenforceable the Constitution's main protection for democracy when it is threatened by a would-be dictator who tries to...
A would-be dictator. A guy who was president of the United States before, was never a dictator during his time in office, and left on Inauguration Day.
Overthrow the Constitution, stay in power beyond the end of his term, doesn't quite...
He was president. He didn't do that.
...succeed, and then tries again.
These people, they really never stop, do they? Hey, coming up, we're going to talk about the record border numbers. An invasion's going on. Have you heard about it? Mark Krikorian will weigh in from the Center for Immigration Studies. We've got new details there. Also, some information about Biden's secret flights all over the country to help the invaders. Mark Krikorian has the exclusive details ahead on the Vince Coglianese Show. And I've got the big interview with former President Donald Trump coming up here in the 5 o'clock hour. Don't miss a moment. It's all ahead.